Hi, I hope you enjoyed parts 1 and 2 of the podcast segment with Dr. Jaquita Shea Johnson. Here's part 3. On the topic of, I guess, women's roles in the Cherokee culture, I know many other Native American cultures were structured the same way, but some of them were different. Some may be matriarchal as opposed to matrilineal. Some might be both. How would you compare the Cherokee to other Native American cultures?
Oh, that's an interesting and also very big question. So I think that it's important for us to understand, first of all, that they're that tribes are their own sort of nation, right? And so
Yeah.
tribes have their own sovereignty to practice however they want to practice their cultures and their governance and that kind of thing. And I know that you get it, but I also just wanted to say it so that I've done that due diligence. Um, but the ways that it works, I think, across the board or comparatively, are that there are tribes that are historically and traditionally both um, patrilineal and matrilineal and matriarchal and patriarchal, and some combination of both, and also maybe in a spectrum, right? And so I think there's not like a clear comparison, but rather just variations that worked for different reasons and different purposes across the board. And I do believe, and I do know that there are tribes that like the Cherokee people were matrilineal and matriarchal, but then colonialism changed those practices. So I think that, and then I think likewise, there are also some tribes that did manage to maintain some of those practices. So I think it's a really kind of mixed bag, and I don't think that I could give you a very clear answer across the board, but I do think that it's important for us to think about like how these different structures and gender structures play into the very tapestry across indigenous communities in the United States and in Turtle Island as a whole. So Turtle Island encapsulating essentially the continent of North America. And then I think that plays out in a different way on the large global scale. But I'm not sure if I entirely answered your question, but I do think there are a lot of different. I think it's beyond a binary, and that there's instead a full spectrum of history there, and a lot going on. But I think that there are a lot of things that we can learn from thinking through maybe what those backgrounds look like and what power look like across gender.
Mm-hmm. You bring an interesting insider and expert perspective on this topic. So I'm curious when you mentioned, how these tribes have, somewhat given way to the patriarchal systems that we see, what would you say in your expert and insider opinion were some of the main, I guess, factors that kind of made that push and that transition into that from the original way of life into what we see now?
I think the main force is colonialism. And so what I mean by that is that when the European powers, the European settlers came to the United States, what is now the United States. It's so hard to talk about history in the modern day at the same time, lots of different tensions. But when they settled on the North American continent, they didn't really know what to do with like a matriarchy, right? So these, remember, are patrilineal societies for long, like centuries, right? So they have this very patriarchal patrilineal system in place. And I'm talking like Spain, France, England primarily are the big three, right? And so they have long systems of power that are very male dominated and male oriented. And so they just don't really even know what to conceive of a matriarchy when they get here, right? They want to talk to the men. When they come to a tribe, they don't want to talk to the women. And so I think like tribes begin to maybe realize that to have any real negotiation power, to have any real um, diplomacy power, they needed to, like, men needed to be in those roles because men were the people that will be possibly even listened to, before, rather than a woman who would be dismissed or not even seen in the first
Yeah.
place. So I think that's maybe the main force and maybe the mechanism behind. I'm not a historian, so there may be some flaws in that, but I am interested in history. So I think I think that that's a really good way of thinking about it, right? To think about what power looked like for those cultures and how they had to negotiate power with these very patriarchal forces. Likewise, I would add that it was complicated by the um, colonial forces and their coercion towards assimilation. And so
Mhm.
their argument was that it's good to be patriarchal and patrilineal, right? That's the civilized way of being. And so for tribes who wanted to save their selves, right? This was a tactic of survival, to try not to be erased. One of their tactics was to think about how power worked and to think about how to fit best into the society
Yeah.
so that they weren't killed, right?
Right. Wow. I mean, it's a lot knowing that, that happened and the way that in which it did.
Yeah, it was a big rhetorical move, and it's kind of a daunting one to think about, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, when we think about how, like, maybe it's easy to view it from our own eyes, like, oh well, they could have fought that, or what if they did something differently? But it's hard to make that argument, like, from the present day when they were sort of faced with such dire consequences.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
How would you say that's kind of influenced women today in today's society?
Oh, well, it has shaped a lot. I think it was a very impactful move for us.
Yeah.
Um, it really stripped a lot of power, and I think had really dangerous consequences for women across the board, for at least Native women, for sure. So there is an author, Deborah Miranda, and she has a memoir book called Bad Indians, where she charts the genealogy, what she calls the genealogy of violence, that
Mhm.
shows, from her Esalen Chumash background, how colonialism impacted her family in a very gendered way, and um, how the violence that was perpetrated on the men sort of like filtered down, and trickled down to the women in the family. And so it created this complicated legacy, showing how even the violence against, that was directed towards Native men then made its way to the Native women and so on. And so I think that's a really good book to read. That's interesting and says a lot, in general. But that also, I think, really plays into this topic of thinking how this violence is very structural, and how, we're still seeing how it plays out today. So I think that it plays out, for Native women like you and me, in a lot of ways. We see it in things like the missing and murdered Indigenous women's crisis, um, where Native women have historically, been victims of, a lot of gendered violence, and a lot of
Yeah.
but a lot of terrible violence, and a lot of, really awful things have happened to Native women, and I think are still happening to Native women, and we see it through those sorts of, situations. And I'm glad right now that there are a lot of people working to actively push back against that. We have the Sovereign Bodies Institute, and then there's, just missing and murdered Indigenous women's organizations that are working to counteract that violence. But it's about power being taken away from us and what that looks like over generations, right?
Yeah.
That get us where we are today. So I think that having these conversations is really impactful, and thinking through and remembering, oh, we came from powerful structures, right? We came from generations of women who endured and survived, and who internally deep down in us have that power still.
Yeah.
We just have to find it.
You mentioned those organizations. I was curious if you have any personal involvement that you've done with any, within the nation to combat certain issues, or just in general, some passions that you might pursue within it.
Sure. I have not participated with those organizations specifically, though I am in awe of everything they're doing. They do such important stuff. They do things from like help families with searches. They help families with things like recoveries.
Mm-hmm.
If the person is lost truly, then they help with things like services and funeral expenses and things like that. They also help with support and guidance and emotional support and grievance support in ways that is really useful. They have constructed databases to sort of like keep track, but also to show the monumental impact that this has on Native communities, and to just sort of show what those statistics look like from a very large scale sort of lens. And I think that those are really impactful. They can be used to, that sort of data can be used to push back in really meaningful ways, like more funding and more help, and also to bring awareness. So I think they're doing such wonderful work, and that's not my, I'm a rhetorician. So, so I talk about like meaning making and whatnot. But it's a little bit different. The ways that I am working on sort of beginning to dig deep into what this means for me as a person, as a human, and as a Native woman, is through maybe my research practices and the things that I'm doing as a scholar. And I'm working on a book project right now where I'm examining the ways that our matrilineal identity and clan identity, in my family specifically, was erased through the federal record keeping system, and through just the generational violence and colonial violence, right, that sort of shaped that entire transition. But I'm looking at that as a way to sort of push back on how we can recover, reclaim what it means to belong to a society, and to maybe think about what it meant for women to have those powers, and for us to be to figure out our own identities and to figure out our own power in this larger context.
Yeah, I think it's really important to spread that information, and I think it really just starts with your own exploration of your own identity, and with that you can help others, you can educate others on what society used to look like, how it was balanced, unbalanced, so that way we can, I guess, bring it to today and see how we can apply that history. And I know you're a professor, and I was curious if you're, I guess, incorporating any of those ideas in any of your classes that you're teaching.
Oh, I definitely do.